They had lost the war, but they didn't know it yet. In 1944, thousands of German soldiers were captured across Europe. Exhausted, starving, and broken, they were told they were being sent to America. To most of them, America was a myth, a propaganda image, a land of greed, chaos, and brutal enemies who tortured prisoners. As they stepped onto the transport ships, the rumors began. Some said the Americans used prisoners for experiments. Others whispered that no one ever came back, and as the engines roared and the shoreline of Europe disappeared, many believed they were being sent to their deaths. But what awaited them on the other side was nothing they could have imagined. When the first German prisoners saw the American coastline, they froze. No ruins, no hunger, no fear, just calm towns, clean streets, and people who didn't even look at them with hatred. For the first time in years, they saw life that wasn't shaped by war. The voyage across the Atlantic took weeks. The ships were filled with silence, broken only by the sound of chains and the creaking of steel. Many of the men were no older than 20. They had fought for Hitler's Reich, but now, for the first time, they began to ask themselves, what was it all for? Some tried to keep discipline. They sang marching songs in the lower decks. They spoke of honor, of loyalty, but deep inside, a quiet voice began to grow. Maybe everything they were told was a lie. When the ships reached the American coast, the soldiers expected barbed wire, dogs, and beatings. What they found instead were buses waiting for them, clean, organized, efficient, and guards who spoke politely. No shouting, no humiliation. One prisoner later wrote, "They treated us as men, not as enemies." That was more confusing than any weapon they could have used. They were taken to camps spread across the United States, from Texas and Louisiana to Wisconsin, Georgia, and even as far as Arizona. Each camp was surrounded by fences, but inside was a world that felt unreal. Rows of wooden barracks, a canteen with food that most of them hadn't seen in years. Bread, meat, butter, coffee. Some cried when they saw the tables, not because they were hungry, but because they realized their enemies were living better than the families they had left behind in Germany. Every new arrival was inspected, given clothes, and allowed to shower, something most hadn't done properly in months. The American guards didn't beat them. They didn't insult them. They even handed out soap. One soldier said later, "At first we thought it was a trick, that the food was poisoned or the kindness was a trap, but it wasn't. It was real, and that was the beginning of our confusion." The psychological shift began here, in silence. No lectures, no re-education, just exposure to a world that contradicted everything they had believed. They saw American workers joking with guards. They saw newspapers filled with criticism of the government, something unthinkable back home. They saw freedom, not in slogans, but in small things, in laughter, in books, in how people spoke to each other. And it began to break something inside them. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, like a wall cracking from within. As one German sergeant recalled years later, "In Germany, we were told America was a country of chaos and moral decay. But in that camp, I saw order, justice, and dignity. I realized I had been fighting a ghost." The first few weeks were filled with silence and distrust. Prisoners avoided looking at the guards. They didn't speak much. But over time, small gestures began to change things. A guard giving extra bread to a sick man. A farmer letting prisoners listen to a radio. An officer allowing letters to be sent home. Little acts of humanity. That carried more weight than any speech. For many of them, this was the first time they felt treated like humans. Not tools of a regime, not expendable soldiers, not numbers. And that realization was far more powerful than fear. "We had expected hell," wrote one prisoner, "but America gave us something more dangerous. It gave us the chance to think. When they arrived at the camps, most of the men didn't know what to expect. They were led through the gates, surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed guards. It looked like any other prison camp, but what happened inside was unlike anything they had imagined. The German prisoners were assigned to barracks, each with bunk beds, a small stove, and even electric lights. For men who had spent months sleeping in muddy foxholes, it felt unreal. Every morning began with roll call, followed by breakfast. Real breakfast. Eggs, coffee, milk, bread, butter. Not the watery soup or moldy rations they had known at the front. One POW later said, "I felt more human in an American prison camp than I ever did in the German army." Work and routine. To keep the men occupied, the Americans introduced work programs. Prisoners were sent to nearby farms to help with harvesting or to factories to replace American workers who had gone to war. For each day of labor, they received small wages, credits they could spend in camp canteens. They bought cigarettes, shaving cream, chocolate, and sometimes even musical instruments. A few built guitars from wood scraps. Others played chess, read books, or painted. Some took English lessons from volunteer teachers. Slowly, boredom turned into routine. Routine turned into comfort. And comfort became something dangerous. It made them think. The letters. The camps allowed mail. For the first time since their capture, prisoners could write to their families in Germany. The letters were censored, but they carried something powerful. A sense of connection. One soldier wrote home, "Mother, do not worry. They feed us better here than we were ever fed in the army. The Americans are not the monsters we were told." When that letter arrived in Germany, it was read by neighbors, shared in whispers, and slowly began to erode the image of the American enemy. Education and re-education. Officially, the Americans didn't re-educate the prisoners, but they didn't need to. Reality was doing the job. In the camps, prisoners could attend lectures, debates, and film screenings. They watched documentaries about democracy, about the war, and sometimes about the atrocities committed by their own regime. At first, most refused to believe them. They called it propaganda. But over time, as new prisoners arrived from Europe with stories of bombed cities and concentration camps, the walls of denial began to crack. One man wrote, "I laughed when they showed us films about the camps. I called it lies. But then I met a soldier from Poland, and I could not laugh anymore." Inside every camp, there were two kinds of prisoners, the loyal Nazis and the quiet doubters. The loyal ones tried to maintain order. They held secret meetings, punished traitors, and spread fear among those who questioned the Reich. But as the months passed, their influence began to fade. Because outside their ideology, the men found something far stronger: normal life. They were allowed to play football, stage theater performances, even print their own camp newspapers. Some of the articles were so honest that American guards began secretly reading them. The war had taken everything from these men: pride, home, purpose. But here, behind barbed wire, they began to rebuild their humanity. The irony was painful. They were prisoners, but they had never felt freer. Inside the camp, there were rules, but also trust. The guards treated them as men, not animals. There were no beatings, no humiliation. Even escape attempts were rare, not because of fear, but because many didn't want to leave. One American guard later recalled, "We used to joke that if we opened the gates, half of them wouldn't even run." At first, the change was invisible. No one spoke about it, but it was there, in the way the prisoners stood, the way they looked at each other, the way they began to talk after lights out. The conversations changed. They no longer spoke of Hitler. They spoke of home, of mothers, wives, and the world they left behind. They compared notes. about the lies they were told and the truths they were starting to see. Some tried to hold on to their beliefs. They said, "This is all a trick. America wants to weaken us." But others began to doubt. They saw how the guards treated them, with fairness, even respect. They saw African American soldiers in uniform, something unthinkable in Germany, and it confused them deeply. They had been taught that non-Aryans were inferior. Yet here, those same men carried authority, discipline, and dignity. "We began to question everything," one officer wrote. "The hierarchy we believed in suddenly looked foolish." As the months turned into years, some prisoners asked to stay longer. Even after the war had ended, they feared returning to Germany. Not because of punishment, but because they didn't recognize that country anymore. One said, "In Germany, we were told we were superior. In America, I learned that superiority doesn't come from race. It comes from how you treat others." As Germany collapsed, letters stopped coming. Entire cities vanished under bombs. Families disappeared. And inside those American camps, far from the ruins, the prisoners began to feel something new. Guilt. Guilt for surviving. Guilt for living well while others starved. And guilt for realizing the truth too late. A former sergeant remembered, "It was the first time I felt shame for the uniform I wore." Not pride, shame. In those moments, many prisoners found comfort in each other. The guards noticed groups of men sitting outside at dusk, talking quietly for hours. No one knew what they said, but perhaps they were learning how to be men again. A new kind of brotherhood emerged, not built on orders or ideology, but on understanding. One American officer described it best. They arrived as soldiers of the Reich. They left as men who had seen America and saw themselves for the first time. When the war ended in 1945, the camps were still full. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers sat behind American fences, men who had fought for a world that no longer existed. They waited for news from home. Some received letters from families who had survived. Others, nothing but silence. Entire cities were gone. Entire families erased. And yet behind those fences, life continued. The prisoners planted gardens, built chapels, and even organized small orchestras. The war was over, but their transformation had only begun. In 1946, the process of repatriation began. One by one, the prisoners were told they would be going home. Some cheered, others stood in silence, unsure of what home even meant anymore. Many didn't want to leave. They had learned English. They had made friends among the guards. Some had even fallen in love with local women. For them, America had become more than the land of the enemy. It had become a place where they rediscovered what it meant to be human. One POW said, "I went to America as a Nazi soldier. I left as a man who no longer believed in hate." When the ships docked in Europe, the returning men stepped into a world of ruins. Germany was shattered, not just in buildings, but in spirit. The cities were piles of rubble. The air smelled of smoke and loss. There was no celebration for them. Only hunger, shame, and suspicion. Many of them walked the streets feeling like strangers in their own country. They had seen another world, and now they had to live among the ashes of their old one. Some hid their time in America, afraid to be seen as soft. Others spoke quietly about what they had learned, and were met with disbelief. "You were treated well by the enemy?" "Impossible," people said. But it was true. And that truth, that quiet, dangerous truth, would change Germany more than any bomb. In the years that followed, many former POWs played an unexpected role. They became teachers, engineers, and thinkers who helped rebuild a new Germany, a democratic Germany. They remembered the libraries, the debates, the freedom they had seen in those American camps. They wanted to bring a piece of that back home. Some of them even wrote memoirs. One former officer said, "America didn't conquer us with weapons. It conquered us with humanity." That sentence would echo through decades of reconciliation. Not all went back. Several thousand German POWs chose to remain in the United States. Some applied for citizenship after the war. They married American women, raised children, and never spoke much of the past. They built quiet lives as farmers in Texas, mechanics in Wisconsin, and craftsmen in the Midwest. They had once fought to destroy America. Now they helped build it. "I never thought I would love the land I was told to hate," said one of them many years later. "But here, I learned what freedom really means." Today, most of those men are gone. Their camps are silent. Grass grows over the old barbed wire. And yet, if you walk through the sites in Texas or Georgia, you can still find traces, names carved into wood, letters preserved in museums, and faded photos of men smiling behind fences. They were enemies once, but in those photographs, they look at peace. Because for them, America wasn't just a prison, it was a mirror, showing them who they could have been all along. History often measures wars in battles, victories, and losses. But the quiet transformations, the moments when men change their minds, are what truly end wars. Inside those American camps, the enemy was not broken by force. He was changed by dignity. And in that moment, the war ended not on the battlefield, but inside the human heart. "We came as soldiers," one former prisoner wrote before his death. "But we left as men who understood that freedom is not something you fight to destroy. It's something you fight to deserve."